Connor, I cannot believe that this is the sixth episode post revamp already.
It's been good. I'm feeling pretty good about it. How about you?
Yeah, I've come away like pretty much every single one of them has been like one of the most enjoyable ones that I've done in the 3.5 years. Like I've come away energized after every one. You weren't on this one, but we did one with Jacob Helverson and Nathan Woods last week talking about unreasonable hospitality, and that was just like, yeah, it was just nugget after nugget, and it was the same as as with Big No, and yeah, they're really fun conversations first and foremost, and if the audience don't like them, at least we're enjoying them.
Yeah, I'm loving it. I'm loving it. As the audience feedback, how's that been?
Well, we're awaiting audience feedback, so I'll say this now. If anyone wants to email and give us feedback or ideas for future episodes, or just let us know how we've been doing post revamp, then please email nick@glampitect.com. To be fair, we might have got some emails off the back of the last episode, but we're recording this in advance, so apologies if you've emailed since. But yeah, we'd just love some comments and to get your thoughts. We want to involve the community more. We've got plans to do that at some point, so please do give us your feedback, whether you like the new formats, whether you don't, which ones you've liked the most, and we'll try and work around what you guys want. So today's guest, Will Spurzem, Boundary Works Design and Development. I know Will a little bit, but you know him a lot better. So Connor, why don't you tell us why you wanted to bring him on?
Yeah, I'm really excited about Will as a guest, primarily because very few people have done as many legitimate and professional glamping site designs as Will. And the core of his background, I think he comes from an architecture background or design, but he was one of the site planners for Autocamp for I think 3 years, and I think he drew up something to the tune of 15 to 20 of their site plans, including layouts, construction budgets, working adjacent to utilities, guest experience. So a really good understanding of construction costs, pros and cons of different layouts, and then really taking those through and seeing them actually stabilized and ramped up, and having a feedback loop of, they have probably 5 to 8 stabilized properties. So getting the feedback loop of, hey, what in past site designs has gone well, what has not done well, and what can we improve upon in the future. So like that part of site design, that feedback loop of stabilized properties and multiple properties in different weather environments and different customers is hugely valuable. So I'm excited to dive into that. And then the second part is in the last 2, maybe 3 years, he's branched off and started his own firm doing site design and architecture and design consulting. And he's worked at everything from one-off unique stays, which I think is an audience we're trying to cater to a little bit more, as well as landscape hotels, which is an audience we want to include a bit more, and glamping locations. And everything from structure design to site design. And he and I have had the opportunity to partner on 2 projects. One was a really cool marina / campground / glamping resort in the Northeast on the water, a rehabbed campground, and a couple others. And so I just think there's few people that have as much in-depth experience in the industry as him. So I'm super excited.
Perfect intro. I'm looking forward to getting into it. And here's Will. Give us a bit of info about your background and what you do at Boundary Works.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. My background is I started out in traditional architecture. So I went to a 5-year undergraduate program, moved to San Francisco and joined a large 100-person firm that was doing multifamily, hospitality, residential, wineries, and a lot of custom homes. Followed that, left with another partner, and was in those traditional architecture roles for about 11 years. And then I really wanted to do a more hands-on approach to some of the design and building. So I joined a Y Combinator startup that was focused on net zero prefab. So we were selling kit homes after the big Sonoma fires, and really working in that space against Connect Homes and Blue Homes, and those were our major competitors. Following that, I joined Autocamp, where I was the design director for 3 years. And now I run Boundary Works. So I had about a 16-year run of various companies before founding this company.
You don't look old enough to have had a 16-year run. You look like you're in your 20s.
Yeah, what's your secret?
Sunblock.
What moisturizer are you using? Sunblock.
Yeah.
Step one.
Yeah, I'm the guy before every meeting putting it on. Does anybody need a little,
What years were you at Autocamp, and can you just tell us a little bit about like how many properties they had up and running at your start and then at your finish?
Yeah, so I joined in 2020, in that kind of early spring, late winter season, and they were just coming out of their first major location. So actually, my first day on the job as design manager, I was sweeping the pool deck and scooping tadpoles out of the pool because they were photographing it that afternoon. So it was a wild first day, but I got to meet everybody on site and really dive into the project. So
that's what you went to architecture school for, clearing the pool.
Yeah, exactly. Chasing tadpoles. But we launched that property basically the week I started. So I got to see immediately what were the successes and failures of their first ideal-sized project. And then over the 3 years, we looked at easily 40 other properties, ended up moving on another 12. So after Yosemite, we had Cape Cod, Joshua Tree, Asheville, Sequoia, Texas, that whole run of projects that you can now see on their website. And after 3 years, when I was leaving, I had 11 projects and 60 odd consultants, and the role had changed to very much more of a process role. They'd really ironed out a lot of the major design features, and that was a good transition point to say, hey, you really need less of a design director and more of a process person here.
Just for the audience who maybe don't know what Autocamp is, what kind of sites do they have? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, so their basic premise is they are focused on connecting people to the outdoors and to each other. So they have, typically it's 100 units. Most of them are Airstreams that are custom, direct from the Airstream factory, and about a 4,000 to 5,000 square foot clubhouse with amenities like a lounge and a bar and retail area. And they are typically located within 3 hours of a major national park or other major outdoor venue. So obviously Cape Cod has its own character. Yosemite is very iconic. Joshua Tree, all of these places have, a really key outdoor feature. And they're, 2 to 3 hours from a major metropolitan area.
What you said, you were coming on board spring of 2020, so you're in the thralls of COVID, and that was when they were getting their first site online?
I should retract that. It was 2019 when Yosemite launched. That was it. It was right before COVID, so I had about a 9-month run right before COVID hit.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. You said, you were there when they were figuring out what they did right at the first site, what they didn't do so right at the first site, all the way through to when they had several sites open. So I'm intrigued as to, Connor mentioned it in the intro actually, the feedback loop, and what Autocamp did differently from the last site that they did when you were there to that first site.
I think the biggest change was not necessarily, there was lots of small changes that came from the guest experience. The biggest change was really helping the acquisitions team who's looking at 20 sites in a month. The design team, the construction team, we went over to the acquisitions team and helped them develop a buy box, which is somebody who's not a land use expert, who's really more into commercial real estate, who joins this team. They need to look at 20 sites in a month and really vet them. So we came up with some metrics based on lots of experience and lots of test fits to say, you've got 40 acres. Here's how to determine where the usable areas are. Here's some rules of thumb for how many units per acre, whether that's 6 units per acre or 10 units per acre, how flat is it? And that really helped streamline the overall process and moved a lot more deals through. They were able to turn over more quickly and figure out what was functional, what was worth calling leadership to get on a plane and come see that land. On the guest feedback side, the GM and operations team were amazing about doing it once a month or every 2 months. We would scour through all of the guest reviews and flag certain issues, search for common words, and raise those issues with a broader leadership team that included the design and construction team, the acquisitions team, the operations team, some of the local GMs, as well as the brand opening team and marketing. So we would tackle those things and be constantly refining, our offering, whether it was a different piece of furniture that kept failing or if it was a broader brand shift. Some things just didn't really land with people outside of California and some things really did. So we'd kind of keep massaging those features to make sure that there was kind of a consistent guest feedback loop.
That's interesting. What was there any big lessons on East Coast versus West Coast or North versus South, like Midwest versus the South, in terms of design or things that resonated with an audience in the West versus the Northeast? Any interesting lessons there?
Yeah, I think the big one is, like any experiential outdoor hospitality brand, all of these companies are essentially variations on a limited service hotel, right? Most of these companies, Autocamp included, don't have a full restaurant. They don't have concierge. It's outdoors. And so everybody's picking and choosing what elements of a normal hotel they want to have on that property. And that takes a lot of education. So the biggest feedback loop and the biggest issue, regardless of geography, was just communication. Making sure that the guest shows up and they know what they're going to get. They know that they have an option to cook food. They don't bring a cooler full of food and then they're all upset that they have nowhere to go and nothing to do. So that was the biggest feedback loop there. And where that kind of really, started to represent some changes in geography was the booking window on the East Coast was much shorter. People wanted to see what the weather was like. They were booking 2 and 3 weeks out. Whereas on the West Coast, people were booking 2 to 4 months out. So all of those sales promotions and marketing and everything had to be retooled. That seasonality was so strong in other markets that, we really had to tailor the group sales, the marketing, promotions. And obviously when you're looking at a portfolio of properties and your ADR and revenue, summary, you start to see some disjointed numbers that would manifest, and that was then explained by that change in booking window and turnover.
Do you think that disparity between the two is more based off of the different customer and like how the customer behaves, or is it more based off different weather patterns, or both?
Yeah, I think it's definitely more, I think it's a weather pattern. I also think that there's a kind of typical, I hesitate to use the word like habit or vibe, but on the West Coast, we tend to see these places like Yosemite. People who are at all familiar with camping in California know that it's like buying concert tickets. Unless you're on that Camp America website the day that campsite opens up, you're just not getting one, at least on a weekend. And that tends to translate into a lot of hospitality bookings, especially in these rarer places. And on the East Coast, where there's historically been more options and a higher density, they can play a little more fast and loose, and they do want to prioritize the weather. They don't want to plan a trip and have it be rained out by a big storm. So
I think it's clear from what you've been saying that just how important the guest feedback loop is, and how much there's only so much you can kind of prep for, and you will learn so much when you actually open and iterate. So how do you think like an independent, let's call it mom and pop operator, can prepare for that? And kind of, they've obviously got to have a vision for what they want for their site, but they also need to be kind of agile and be able to respond to that guest feedback loop. So how do they kind of balance those two things, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you treat your amenity offering, your package, when they're creating everything they're going to put on that site, whether it's furniture, experiences, or a level of service, that they look at it like a budget, and that they leave some in reserve. There's going to be some misses out of the gate, and there's going to be some immediate needs that come to mind, and you need to tackle those quickly, especially in those first 6 to 9 months. That's where you're going to find those early brand evangelists, the people who organically post about this cool new place they went, and you need to get a lot of those right. So I typically say focus on, get 80% of what you might want to do down the road really dialed in. Don't tackle that next 20% out of the gate, because you're bound to miss a few of those. And I'd leave that extra bit of money, brain power, energy for a couple months in when you can tackle that next piece. And it goes back to the communication piece. Like the guest needs to know what they're going to get, and they need to arrive feeling confident.
Well, it's like what Big Noel Open Sky said a few weeks ago. It's so important to have the guests' expectations meet the reality. And
Exactly.
It's all well and good having amazing marketing and making everything look amazing, but if it looks shit when you turn up or it feels shit when you turn up, then that's a recipe for unhappy guests.
Yeah, and it goes both ways. If they come prepared for a really bare bones experience and then all these extra features are there, they're like, great, I wish I would have known, So
What are the top things to communicate, if someone's opening their own, what are the top things that you need to be communicating with your guests, either on the website, on the unit description, or in pre-automated emails that are sent to them before their stay? I would imagine the top two is there a bathroom and shower in the unit? The second is probably food. Can they get prepared meals on site? Are they going to be cooking on site? Can they store their food in a fridge in the unit? Are those the top two? And then what would be 3, 4, and 5 that they would want to know?
yeah, definitely the, kind of bathing and restroom question in general is everybody's number one choice. For a lot of people who are inexperienced campers, that's where they go first. The second question is food and beverage offerings, and being really clear about what you do offer. I've seen a lot of properties that sort of tiptoe into food and beverage, and it never goes well because people realize they can't get a full meal or they can get half a meal. And then down the line, I think there's a follow-on of, what else is available on site to do, other features that housekeeping or lack of housekeeping needs to be addressed. Is it every 3 days? Is it not at all unless you request it? Some properties like to sneak a fee in there for that extra call. All of those kind of like little things just need to get addressed somewhere so the word is out. I always like to say when something starts to go wrong, all of us will retreat to our experience of a standard hotel. And if you don't have those things, that's where somebody's, a negative moment will start spinning.
Well, that's one thing I would have said to you, Connor, is feedback I've had from a lot of operators is that some people come to a glamping site expecting a hotel. Especially, campers going to glamping, you're probably fine. They know that they're in nature, but hotel stayers who wouldn't necessarily go camping but are going glamping because it bridges that gap, kind of maybe come in thinking, it's going to be like staying at a Hilton. There's going to be no kind of dirt or wildlife or anything like that. And so, a fair amount of feedback I've had from operators is that you need to make clear that you are in the wild, you are in nature. There are going to be critters, maybe bugs, mosquitoes. So I think particularly if you've got like soft wall units and you're really out in nature, then I think it's very, very important to communicate that and remind people that they're not staying in a hotel.
And I imagine those major 3 communications happen at 3 points. One's maybe on your homepage of your website. The second is maybe on the description of your unit. The third is emails sent to the guests before they arrive. And then the fourth is what is told to them at check-in. I guess, am I missing anything there? And is there any strategies or insight you could share on any lessons learned in that department of communication?
Yeah, the big thing that Autocamp did that really brought a lot of guest comfort was they would call almost every new guest and ask them for like any input they had, or like ask for any clarifying questions, like, are you prepared? Do you have any questions? Here's your reservation. Here's how we're handling your billing. And they would they'd deal with that as it was coming along.
So you guys did a pre-call. So any new guests who'd never stayed at Autocamp, they'd 3-4 days before their trip, your guys' guest services or salespeople would call them and just see if they had any questions, make sure they understood what they're expecting.
Yeah, exactly. They would call and ask a couple pointed questions. One was really, are you aware, like, here we're billing you up front and this is where you're getting, and here's some they'd lead with the positives and then make sure that they were, all their expectations were managed as well as they could be. And I think that also allowed a lot of people who were unsure, it gives them that one last point to say, I was actually wondering, do you offer this? Do you have meal kits that we can buy? Is there a microwave? All those little pain points, that one hang up that every guest has, they could swat that one away.
To link that to an episode we had recently with Jacob Helverson, where we were talking about kind of, the calling the guest up and not just explaining to them what they're going to get, but listening to them, hearing kind of what their interests are, why they're in town. Now, I don't know how much Autocamp did this, whether it was more of a standardized process, but particularly if you're trying to create that kind of bespoke, unreasonable hospitality experiences, if you're doing that pre-call where you give them the information, that's also obviously the chance to learn about their site, learn about why they're staying, and kind of start preparing for those moments where you can really surprise them by showing how much you've listened and laying on things that they maybe wouldn't expect as well.
Yeah, and there was another piece there we worked really hard on was basically 3 guest profiles, whether that was like a young couple who is very outdoor savvy, a broad category of basically new to the outdoors. They didn't have very little camping experience or none at all. And then the last group was that sort of older experienced retiree couple that was, out there with lots of experience. And we had 2 or 3, levers to pull for each one of those guests, whether it was like feedback, ideas, trails, everything.
What do you think Autocamp did really well that made them successful?
I think the biggest thing they did was they really honed in on that Airstream outdoor experience, getting people out to that outdoor living space and creating this constant thread through the properties that made them really familiar. It was a consistent through line between all of the properties. So if people went to multiple properties, it was the same feel in a new setting, and the staff really owned that.
And would you have a lot of people staying from site to site and kind of exploring the Autocamp chain?
Yeah, there were a lot of repeat guests. They were some of the strongest ones. We had lots of folks that would visit multiple properties, and it became corporate repeat guests were fantastic from all around the Bay Area and the East Coast, and they were our biggest kind of seed customer base.
I might say, from the outside looking in, one of the things I think Autocamp did super well was, you mentioned at the beginning, was your site selection. And I think you guys chose a lot of markets and properties that were really hard to miss. And like you said, either within 3 hours of an MSA or, next to a major attraction. And a lot of your properties are both. So, Yosemite next to a major national park attraction within 3 hours of the bay, or close to that, maybe 4. And then Russian River within 60 minutes of San Francisco, Joshua Tree within 2 hours of LA and right next to Joshua Tree. So I think, I imagine that's something you had a lot to do with, and you mentioned your criteria, and it sounds like you had a team bringing a funnel of properties for you guys to consider. And that's probably a lesson for the guests is, you might not want to bite on the first property you come across. You might want to look at 5, 10, 15 and start to really see, once you choose your property right, you're married to it. So you mentioned a little bit about the criteria that you guys would use. Basically, if a property was worth, ownership or senior leadership to come and check out, like what were some of the definite yeses? All right, this is meeting this criteria, or big red flag, hey, this isn't going to be worth the fuss for us.
Yeah, I think the 2 primary concerns that we really had were, we're talking about experiential hospitality. So it's adjacent to a beautiful national park or a great feature, but the land itself has to have some character and a bit of excitement. The land has to reflect the broader surroundings. It's not a flat slab in the middle, just off the highway. It has some of those natural features, which feels almost like a bit of an appetizer before the main course of that big national park. So getting the right character of land is really important. And then also finding that balance between what most people consider a very convenient campground and a more resort feel, right? So, you're elevated above that kind of that base level of just a base campground, and moving into a place with a bit of topography and terrain that's still reasonably accessible from roadways and everything else. So it was really trying to find a balance of like, what makes this site special? Does it reflect the character of the area? Is it really beautiful? We want people to come not just for that national park, but also for the property itself.
Presumably at some point you have to think about zoning and permitting suitability as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that was another piece of that buy box, was really understanding the um, where the zoning and permitting allowed for different things. So some of the original auto camps and other companies I've worked with only tackle campground RV parks, and some tackle more of the commercial modular world. And selecting those different unit types can really make or break your development process and that entitlement process, kind of sorting out which is more effective.
How many of your guys' properties were, an existing campground or RV park with the zoning versus, new construction entirely, and potentially like a zoning change? Did you guys have to do zoning change on many of the properties, or how did that typically look for you guys?
Yeah, there's they were about half and half split between that commercial campground RV park, and across my other projects in the last few years, I've seen a similar spread. Those campground RV properties, if they're undeveloped and they're still out there in those kind of prime market locations, they're probably really steep and really hard to build on, which is why they're still sitting there with that zoning designation, because people just can't make it work. You end up with $1 million entry road to get a fire truck up there, and people can't add that to their budget. And the properties that are getting converted and the rezone, usually with like conditional use permits, so they can put some noise ordinances and other things in there. Those tend to drift into more of like the commercial, almost hotel designation. So I think there's a long graveyard. I'll give an example in like San Bernardino County of California. There's 7 or 8 major glamping projects that have gone up to that kind of CEQA planning process and have ground to a halt in lawsuits, and that's been a very educational example for a lot of developers trying to move into that space.
I have this really sad saying, and it is that California is where glamping dreams go to die. Because how many projects sadly get rejected at the permitting process? But Autocamp, it's changed a little bit in the last 2 years of more of the other sites. But for the first kind of 3 years of the industry blowing up, Autocamp was the only major brand player to have multiple locations in California, and you got them approved in some Yosemite, Russian River, Joshua Tree, famously difficult zoning markets. And now I think Getaway's got a couple, Hatopia's got a couple, but like Under Canvas was never able to get into California, I believe. So like, I was just curious, was there a strategy that helped you guys push forward in those scenarios?
That was a lot to do with the early leadership and acquisitions team really hunting through a lot of sites and prioritizing the first few that were campground RV parks because they were a little easier. California also, like every other regulation, has an extra layer of the Housing and Community Development, the state agency that oversees all of the campgrounds and RV parks. So we worked closely with them, and they were the first people to admit that they did not have a good bucket to put a glamping project like Autocamp in. They were dealing with mobile homes and RV parks on one side and primitive campsites on the other, and now you've got this very nebulous, almost hotel-like thing out there.
Don't the HCD have some funny kind of rules on ensuite bathrooms in tents or something like that?
Yes, they do have some archaic plumbing code overlaps that prevent some of the more popular units that are used internationally, like eco-structures and luxury frontiers. Those are a lot harder to get permitted with HCD just because of the way they've structured their code. But they are actively trying to modify that and modernize a little bit. So I've seen some good progress.
The other thing I hear about California is the costs of both the actual permit applications being potentially insane, like tens of thousands of dollars in some cases, and like the environmental studies also being, first of all, required in a lot of cases, and second of all, being very expensive and time consuming.
Yeah, and they can be, and that very much depends on your use and zoning. So if you're staying in that campground RV park range, you can go tackle the environmental stuff fairly easily, and your permit fees aren't huge. The main reason there's a graveyard of projects is a lot of people think they can rezone from residential to commercial, and that basically raises a giant red flag that everybody's going to look at it with a fine-toothed comb. So I think if you can find the right land and stretch your budget a little bit to find something that's already zoned, you can alleviate a lot of that. And otherwise, you're going to be in for a long haul, which I think you've seen from a lot of the Under Canvas and other folks.
So that's a good lesson just for people to pay attention to, which is, going for a zoning change from residential to commercial is going to bring up extra qualifications, which allows different groups to step in and block it, or just extra scrutiny. And then, choosing locations that are existing has a higher success rate.
I think it's important to add as well, because I speak to a lot of people who say, oh yeah, I'll just go and get a rezoning. But if you read a lot of zoning codes, even outside of California, quite often the code will say, in order to have a rezoning, you basically have to prove that the original code was wrong or is outdated or something along those lines. It's not just like, oh, you just change your house to a business and you'll be all right. Like it's not that easy. Usually something has to have gone wrong or has to be out of date to justify the change, and it usually has a public hearing. So people who do say, oh, I'll just get a rezoning, you probably need to, at the very least, speak to the county and figure out their process before you go too far down the track.
Definitely. And one other thing I always like to say is, if you're moving into a place that you are not intimately familiar with, and if you're new to the development world, the first person I always advise people to go find is, who's the least vocal but most knowledgeable local expert, whether that's a land use attorney who's done a similar type of project and has gotten it through the process, or a really qualified civil or site work engineer that you can go find who knows the way that county works and who knows the local people. And just offer to say, hey, let's do a little bit of a consulting agreement. I'm about to enter into a PSA on this piece of property. I'd really like to talk through my options and utilities and roads, and just try and dredge up those early red flags.
That's one thing I'd add as well, is every county is so different. I think my experience is sometimes it will be a little bit clustered, in certain areas, counties in that sort of area will have very similar zoning codes and maybe very similar attitude, but other times it's completely different. And you'll pick up the phone to one and it will be, oh yeah, really happy to help, really keen to develop, and then the next one is like, what's glamping? No, we don't do that around here. And then some won't even speak to you over the phone. You have to go in and have a physical appointment, which makes doing remote zoning analysis really fun. Again, I think the importance of speaking to a local expert can really add something, or at the very least trying to get in front of the county if they want to speak to you anyway.
Will, you mentioned, first thing you do is call local land use attorney or civil or engineering consultants. How would someone find the right person? Is it as simple as a Google search and picking up the phone, or what are you searching, or how are you finding those right folks?
It depends on the project scale, but for the most part, if you're looking to do something in this glamping space on a smaller scale, the first place I send people is to the recent planning commission logs. A lot of those are made public. Those applications. The cover letter to somebody's conditional use permit is almost always written by somebody who's really knowledgeable, whether they're a land use attorney or a civil engineer or an environmental consultant. And if you can find a good example of a comparable project that's of the right scale, and I say that with some caveats, for example, if you're trying to do a 20-acre parcel with call it 30 cabins and a mix of tents, there aren't a lot of land use attorneys in these rural areas that do projects that large. So you draw a big circle, and maybe in the next town over, there's a large office park that was recently done with some development constraints, and find, who is the civil engineer on that project, and then ask who else worked on this, who is the land use attorney. And that can usually lead you to a vein of people who are local, successful, and hopefully not controversial. I've had a few clients led astray by their real estate agent, who promised a lot and knew a lot of people, but did not end up being as resourceful as they may have claimed. So I typically tend to send people to that quiet, confident civil engineer in the corner who knows the game.
That's some serious gold, and maybe I could talk that back to you just to clarify. So let's say I'm trying to develop a glamping property wherever in Jefferson County. So I would go to Jefferson County's website, and I would look at their building approval or development approval list. What's it called? What's that actual list called?
Well, there's usually meeting minutes posted for all of the major planning commission or planning hearings. So if you can find that list of planning commission notes going back, or watch a few recordings of when they've had to approve or deny projects, and just find something in the ballpark of that acreage, that has some controversial things like its own road through it or a curb cut, all those little things that are the hangups for people who don't know how to do these larger developments. And then find the first name of that project team and see if they'll help you network to the other people in it.
So you'd go to Jefferson County website, and then you'd go to the planning tab, and then you'd look at, project proposals, hearings, meeting minutes, and you'd start to look through those, and you're looking for some sort of similar development to your own. You'd click into it, you'd look at the actual written proposal, and then you'd look at the name or the contact information of the person or the group that's in charge of submitting that proposal. Google them, give them a ring, see if they could help you or they know someone who could help you. If your county doesn't have any similar projects, you look at the adjacent counties and do the same process. Did I get that right?
Yeah, perfect. And usually in that process, there's, especially in these rural areas, there's a couple people I'll find that I call the hub. They're a specialist. They're the environmental engineer that does some biology report, and every project in the county uses this one biologist. That's the gold standard of professional contacts, because they know what it's like to work with everybody else. They work with the county, they've worked with civil engineers, they've worked with contractors. If you can find that one person who's in a niche that knows all the other parties, you can ask them for referrals and really, build a wealth of knowledge and experience very quickly for your team.
And then also, if someone's struggling with this, they can call you, right? And you can help them with this?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
I can help talk it through and find some comps.
So I've just remembered, I remember reading probably about 2 years ago, a publication of a permit application in San Bernardino County, and it was an Autocamp one, and it was zoned as a hotel. Were you involved with that? Was that you?
Yeah, I was involved with that. That's their Joshua Tree location, and it was already commercially zoned, but it needed a fairly significant conditional use permit to allow for the hotel use, and that involved a big, public outreach effort. So we did many community meetings, many proactive phone calls to get out in front of that, and worked through it in fairly reasonable pace.
There was a reason why you went for a hotel use, right? Was it because of the certain number of rooms you were allowed or something like that?
Yeah, certain number of rooms, and the way there's some code overlap, which is like what your occupancy and code is on one hand, and then what the zoning and use of your property is on the other. And that's where a lot of these projects get hung up, and that's where people often get in front of a planning person and have reached the end of their ability to parse out these overlapping issues. But when you get over those certain number of units, you're not in a bed and breakfast, you're certainly not residential. But you're not technically providing residences. They don't have full kitchens, you can't rent them out. So you do have to drift back into the hotel use. And, as an aside for that one, we, sent in supplementary letters to say our Airstreams are RVIA certified. They're not under the building code. They're permitted and approved by another agency. Is that okay? And they approved that as well.
I'm assuming a big Airstream development in Joshua Tree went down completely smoothly. There was no objections from the neighbours, and everyone was really, really happy for you to be in town.
Yeah, no, it was definitely rough out of the gate. But we, on my end, there was a broader team of land use experts and project managers there. On my side, I was in charge of really that site planning narrative and how we're making use of the land. And so very careful siting, lots of environmental protections, a very healthy buffer to the neighbors of natural landscape. All of that made it a lot easier to then layer on what the rest of the Autocamp team was doing about estimating TOT taxes and local jobs. And they ended up hiring their head of maintenance from the apartment complex next door, and he was a great advocate, and they made sure to involve as much of the community as possible right out of the gate.
So they went into as much detail as figuring out the effect it would have on taxes, and they really did their research.
Yeah, estimated TOT taxes, estimated employment locally and from abroad. We did some pretty extensive traffic studies for the neighbors to, prove that, there wasn't going to be this huge spike in traffic and that the existing infrastructure was okay and they didn't need a new light and all those little features that sort of helped assuage the neighbors to say, okay, it may not be the natural desert that it was, but as in the range of opportunity here, this is fairly respectful and sensitive. And I think that's the best you can do.
Yeah, for smaller operators who maybe can't afford to, hire experts and, do the traffic studies after traffic studies and things like that, is there anything that you think is really important to get across to neighbors that, any kind of operator can present?
Yeah, I think part of it is just your personal involvement, being willing to go and say, here's what I'm trying to do and here's my goals for the property, and I'm willing to be flexible in how I get there. And so that opens the door for a neighbor who's anxious about the whole thing to voice some concerns, and their biggest gripe might be noise, or it might be traffic, or the fact that the road's not paved. Can we work out a deal to pave this thing and keep the dust down so my house isn't dark brown by the end of the summer? Whatever you can do to open the doors and not build fences right out of the gate, I think will help those development chances.
Just like you need to listen to the guests, presumably you need to listen to the neighbors as well before you start figuring out what they actually want.
Hi, friends. This is your host, Connor Schwab at Sage Outdoor Advisory. If you're launching an outdoor hospitality project like glamping, we can help. We offer feasibility studies and appraisals. What that means is we look at your specific market and proposed business offering and complete an in-depth analysis and financial projections to make sure that your planned business will be profitable. Getting a second opinion on your proposal and forecasted financials is critical to understand before you spend years of your time and hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is particularly important if you are looking to raise money for your project from a bank or private investors. They are going to want to see this type of in-depth analysis from an independent third-party specialist in the industry. We have completed over 250 feasibility studies and appraisals in outdoor hospitality in the US in the last 4 years. So we understand what it takes to bring a project from concept to reality. If this sounds like it could be helpful to you, you can go to our website, sageoutdooradvisory.com, and you can schedule a complimentary consultation with our team. Thanks. Now back to the show.
I'd love to dive into some more of your lessons learned from, both guest experience and operational flow of once a site is up and running, and maybe. And I think I'll start by saying, at least for Autocamp, and I know you've done a lot of consulting and other projects, but, Autocamp's one of the larger, kind of higher density, more professionalized, higher construction budget players out there in terms of development. The biggest thing being a 4,000 to 5,000 square foot lodge, which is always epic and really cool and kind of a signature piece of the property. Is there F&B at all sites?
There is now. Yeah, there is a food and beverage all the way through. It's not a full commercial kitchen, but they do put out quite a bit of food.
I'd love to dive into maybe first, like what your lessons or opinions are on F&B and doing site design with some kind of forward-thinking intelligence, and then diving into maybe housekeeping or like parking and how guests get to your units, and any lessons learned that you've carried forward from your experience.
Sure. I think the F&B question is, people see F&B on paper as a great revenue stream out of the gate. There's margins there, and it can be a bit of a drag on your staffing, especially out of the gate. Autocamp was slow to really roll that out because they wanted to make sure that the core business function, which is an outdoor hospitality experience, was dialed in before they started stretching that front desk staff to take a food order or pour a beer and really add to that labor demand. And I think what most operators would be well served by is to do a survey and put themselves in the shoes of their future guest. It's 8:30 p.m. The family of four just rolled in. Everybody's hungry. What are their options? If there are no options within an hour, then yeah, you definitely need to explore something out of the gate. And that's just a guest service piece, even before you get to the financial one. If you have food and beverage options nearby that are great, maybe you don't need to offer everything out of the gate, and you can build that F&B program in pieces. because I think there's just like with the land use development, a lot of operators have never run a commercial kitchen, and they can be quite burdensome for a new owner to get all of those health permits, get all of that up and running, and it's a bit of a specialized skill. I can roll in and run a bit of a small kitchen, that's a Starbucks format with a turbo chef and a small oven and refrigerators and cold food, and most people can be trained quickly to do that. And so I think that's the biggest piece, is trying to figure out, how do I build on the experience in that geographic area? How do I fill a niche so that my guests have more options without overshooting and trying to achieve that commercial kitchen standard right out of the gate?
Thank you. And what would the lessons learned be on accessibility through the site? One, how are the guests getting themselves and their stuff to each unit? And then also, how is your housekeeping staff going to be going from room to room and turning over linens and cleaning?
Yeah. From an access point of view, I think a lot of that relates to, price point. At a really high-end price point, you don't want to be carrying your luggage. You probably want to ride in a golf cart. If you're getting into that $500, $600, $700 a night range in peak season, the guest who's willing to pay that obviously has very different priorities for the level of service than the guest who is staying at the same property for $150 a night in winter. So I think that's kind of where people need to kind of make sure they're keeping a tab on where their price point's going to land and try and anticipate some of that. If you are, I would say, divorcing yourself from the car makes for a great on-site experience, but it does add some complications about how far people are willing to travel. I always like to tell clients, if it's more than 5 minutes or a quarter of a mile with luggage, it's probably going to stretch their patience and get a little uncomfortable. Most people don't have the money to pave all the pathways, so you're on gravel or decomposed granite, and the wheelies don't work. So now you're talking about wagons to move their things. And there's always going to be a family that asks for a ride. So that's one front desk associate that's making a trip out and back. So finding that sweet spot of what you're willing to offer and how big your site is a challenge for every group, I think, and every site individually. Even at Autocamp, with our best standards, it didn't always pan out the way we wanted. And some properties ended up with a lot more golf carts than I think they originally planned for.
One of the things we do in our every feasibility study that we do at Sage when we're trying to estimate housekeeping is, we try to estimate how long turning over each room is going to take. And that includes kind of transportation to and from there to the next unit or back to resupply, and how much it's going to cost. And we're usually, I would assume for like an Airstream, we would assume it's going to be an hour of labor if you include kind of like start to finish. Mm-hmm. And then, if you're doing it on site, that's obviously cheaper, but if you're going to outsource it, that might be an extra $10 or something like $15 on top of, what an competitive hourly rate would be for that cleaning service.
Yeah, we had to, when I was looking at my own site in the Rockies before the posh stuff was finalised, we were looking at doing a site on a really steep hill, and bearing in mind this is the Canadian Rockies, the winters it gets incredibly snowy and icy, and we never got so far down the track as to the point where we had to have this nailed, but we were really figuring out like, how on earth do we get the cleaners to go from unit to unit without like sliding all the way down the site? So we're thinking, is it a car, is it a buggy? But then we didn't want the guests to see them, so that was kind of a tricky thing. And I think it's probably important to figure out how much you kind of want the guests to see the cleaners and the on-site staff, and if you don't want them to see them, then how you figure out the design accordingly.
Yeah. And that's, again, like, I think there's different strategies for different scales. If you're doing 15 to 30 units and that site's fairly compact and fairly level, that can be hand carts and they're doing their own thing. On a larger site where you do have a lot of trips, that may be a golf cart for two housekeepers where they go do 2 units at once and they can share a cart and resupply. But I would probably start with the basics. If you're in a 4-season climate, how is that housekeeper going to flip a unit while it's raining? And they're going to have some mud. And you've got boots on, boots off, cover issues, floor cleanliness issues. There's a lot to unpack there. And there's a lot in your staffing model to allow for some some flexibility. You can dial in some of those units to a 35-minute turnaround, but as soon as it rains, you're going to add another 20 minutes to that just to keep your feet clean and shuffle those boots off and on 10 times a day. And I think that's where a lot of people get hung up on, that it's getting close to 4 o'clock. It's a little rainy out there. Your housekeeping's stressed. The guests are coming in a little weary of camping in the rain. And so I always encourage people to kind of build the best case scenario and then add 20% to your housekeeping estimate. One example I'll give quickly is that one of the Autocamp properties, they did put a GPS training watch, just wrapped it around the post of one of the golf carts and sent it around for the day. And I think we were all startled by how much time that golf cart spent in transit. It covered a good 15 miles that day. And that wasn't even a full, 8-hour shift. That was a 5.5-hour housekeeping shift.
Well, I do want to start talking a little bit about Boundary Works. I do have one last question on Autocamp. Connor, did you have any more questions on Autocamp first?
Now let's dive into his consulting.
Okay, cool. Okay, I've got one very selfish question on Autocamp, and you'll see why. First of all, you had private equity backing Autocamp, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whitman Peterson, that's correct, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Posh. I'm obviously involved with Posh Outdoors, which is doing developments, and that's backed by investors. And we've done a crowdfunding round. So the first round is very much backed by friends, family, the Glamping community, podcast listeners. So it's not quite like we haven't got the suits staring down our shoulders, breathing down our necks on every single move we make. They do trust us, thankfully. Thank you for all who's invested. Anyone else can hit me up if they want more. But at some point, probably the second round of financing, we will likely be working with some kind of institution, whether it's private equity, venture capital, whatever it may be. And I think it's going to be very important that we pick the right partner who trusts us and isn't constantly breathing down our necks. And I don't know what kind of partner Whitman Peterson was like, but I'm interested to know what it was like working with private equity and knowing that there is that layer of not necessarily approval, but judgment and ultimately accountability at the end of it, and whether that kind of affected the decisions you made or the approaches you took, if it improved it or if it maybe kind of took away from like the rawness of what you were trying to do.
I would say from a interpersonal relationship, Whitman Peterson was an amazing partner. And that was possible only because of a lot of very productive early conversations that the leadership had with them out of the gate. The whole market's evolving. A lot of private equity companies are much more familiar with this market than they were 6, 7, 8 years ago when Whitman Peterson first reached out to the executive team at Autocamp and Neil and that team. And I don't know the specifics of how that relationship started, but I can speak to ongoing. They were very engaged partners, looking at a narrow range of things. They were really focused on consistent experience, a high quality offering, a level of professionalism among the team, that basically said, if we went to market to sell this business tomorrow, how are the books going to look? How is the team going to look? Because that's a standard you need to maintain at all times. And I thought that was an incredibly productive way of phrasing that conversation, to say, yeah, we can be really scrappy and we can go get in the weeds on all this, but let's keep the bar high. So we're not just doing this in random spreadsheets. We're not having one person who's an island of all the information. If you can build a little more redundancy and at least strive for that level of professionalism early and keep it at a consistent level, then everything moves more smoothly, right? Whether that's your monthly financial reporting, whether that's I would frequently make design presentations to say, hey, we're going to adjust the model a little bit. We're going to make a change to the development budget. Here's my custom furniture package. Is this all approved? And I think if you can, treat it like dating, you need to make it needs to stay, at the forefront of your mind and fresh, and you need to approach it every day like it's new. Then I think it works really well.
As Mr. Organised in the Posh Outdoors team, I've just made a note. I'm going to clip that and send it to them to make sure that they are they keep up and are as organised as I am. So thank you for that. Yeah. That makes my life easier. Boundary Works, you've got your own design consulting development firm now. Every time I hear from you, you're very, very busy, which is clearly a great sign. What's your design process when you start working with a client?
Well, a bit of background on what our kind of project spread is right now. We have about 90% or 80% of our work is experiential outdoor hospitality. The other 10 to 20 is a few residential projects that percolate here and there because they're fun and keeps the mix fresh. And for the hospitality work, about 50% of that is really early phase development work, and the other chunk is more traditional architectural design services, so all the CD sets and everything else. But most of that starts in a really early phase where clients come and they say, I've got 80 acres, I've got an idea for this. How can we start this? What do we do first? Where can we go? And so our process is really like any other good design strategy exercise, is having them tell us more than once, what's your vision for the project? What are your goals? And I often like to ask, what are your goals personally and what are your goals professionally? Because you need to understand the motivations of your client on two levels. And I think that's crucial to all of us. All of us have parts of our job that we feel really emotionally connected to. And there's other parts where we know we need to nail it, but we don't love it. And for some people that might be sorting out housekeeping. They know they need to do it, but they don't know, it's not their happy place. And I think if you can understand that and then start diving into the functional specifics of sites, unit types, count, you can then have a conversation where everything is a ping pong conversation of, are we getting back to those core values and your core motivations? So if you can do that iterative process down the line, every design package or presentation or introduction or phone call to the next person or stage of the process, if you keep coming back to that central core feature, you'll end up with a really great product.
I'd like to meet the person whose happy place is figuring out cleaning schedules, because they are not my kind of person.
I've met a few, and they're great at it. They're really good at it.
Yeah, I can't do contracts. Contracts are, reading through lawyer stuff is my nightmare.
Yeah.
The antithesis of my soul.
Yeah.
Why do you think I didn't bother with becoming a lawyer after I graduated at uni?
Oh yeah, you got a law degree. That's hilarious.
Yep.
I'll just call you Nick. You can do it for me.
Yeah.
Will, would love to learn a little bit more about the types of projects that you've gotten to work at for Boundary Works, and any that maybe you're most excited about or were just really cool concepts.
The cool shit again.
Yeah, cool shit.
Well, I'll start with the functional stuff, which is all very cool. Boundary Works, we've been working on a variety of price points and project sizes. So everything we've done, we helped a client do a big residential development in rural Texas outside of Round Top that is now looking at putting a wellness spa sports facility on part of that parcel. So fun to have a repeat client coming back that's looking to, take that land use planning package we did to a whole next level. One I'm most excited about that's soon to be wrapping up construction in Sonoma is a project called River Electric that's 40 tents in the Redwoods, 2 very large pools, and a cluster of buildings that all have the backdrop of these redwoods wrapping around you. And that's just outside of Guerneville in Sonoma and wine country. So you've got Corbel Cellars, 5 minutes down the road. You can walk into town and go to all those food and beverage options. And that site's really unique because it's right near the river. It's actually a property designed to flood. So we have really cool materials, really resilient structures, some great waterproof vaults for all the electronics. And that's going to be a pretty fantastic day pass setup, but also have event planning and overnight stays in the tents. So that will be opening first.
Every designer and architect I've met in this industry seems to absolutely love their job. Like, is that the case with you?
It is. I think I had to leave traditional architecture to sort of come back to it with a little extra lens to, I think, appreciate it even more. These days, it's been really exciting, after Autocamp, to meet people who have a vision and a passion for whatever they want to achieve, and then help them get there. And selfishly, if it's not my project, I can take that extra 10% of stress off and actually be a little more clear in my advice. Without that personal, it's not my company, it's not my life or death project. I can then help them, be more successful and give clearer and better designs.
Are there any common traits, and you can include Autocamp in this as well, but also the clients that you've been working with, any common traits of the best developers, dreamers that you've worked with?
I would say the best developers, best like visionary people are the ones who are most flexible. And I'll like use an example, like some people talk about like fishing or tennis, like how you hold the rod or the racket, like hold tight but quick to drop it, right? So strong convictions about what you know and what you really like. But if you come up against something and you find that it's not working, being able like quick to drop that when you have the right experts around you, I think is really, really strong. Like if you're holding to the core focus, don't hold on to things too long, and because people will get bogged down in that. Autocamp was really good about making sure that they talked to a group, and the group consensus maybe wasn't what that particular leader really wanted, but they were willing to let that go because they saw the other voices in the room speaking up strongly.
I've been saying this a lot in this podcast. It's there's actually glamping and outdoor hospitality really isn't that different from general business and entrepreneurship. Like that's a trait that you need to have in business in general, is have a clear vision for what you want and an idea of what you want, but you have to be prepared to be flexible. And I think we like to think we're probably a little bit different from other businesses, but really it's very, very similar. And I think there's definitely some common traits across the board. And you need to understand the industry when you're designing a site and figuring out what the guests actually want, and be humble enough to listen. But I think you need to go into it with similar traits to any other business. And I say this every week now.
I'd be curious to know your thoughts, Will, on unit types, kind of pros and cons of different unit types. I think it's canvas versus hardwall versus kind of a hybrid structure. And I think Autocamp's gone through an interesting revolution of, I think when they started, it was 100% Airstreams, and now a lot of their sites will have, X suites, these really nice modern cabins, and then they'll also have tents. So they're kind of, they have their core unit in their brand, which is built around an Airstream, but have diversified. And I know you've seen a lot of different sites in different locations and different unit types. I guess, do you have a unit that you would use, and would that change depending on your climate?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is climate and seasonality are really the first driver for unit selection. Obviously, I think if you look at the two extremes of the glamping world right now and you say, all right, we're going to go look at, the Four Seasons, Naviva, and all these like higher end resorts. And then at the other end of the scale, you look at under canvas and where they're operating and their seasonal limits. I think there's a lot to be said for you either really, my personal opinion is you either really commit to the canvas world or you get out of it completely. I think one of the things, if you start mixing unit types and you've got half your property is open all year and the other half you're shutting down, I think it's more trouble than it's worth sometimes. I think is just a cautionary tale about like, how many hours does it really take to put those things up and down every season? Where are they stored? How much cleaning goes into those? There's a lot of extra man hours that can go into those soft-sided products to keep them up and running that can really erode your returns on those unit types. And then I'd say on the, as you move into the hardwall world, there's a lot of variations now from all these various manufacturers that have more insulation, different fabric types that are a little more four-season, ensuite bathrooms and mini splits. And I think that really gets to a point where like, what is your core feature offering? And I think if you dial that in and take your seasonality into account, you can pretty quickly, your unit type will become clear.
Let's say a crazy, ridiculously wealthy business person had $5 million that they wanted to blow, and they said, Will, I want you to design your absolute dream experiential hospitality destination. What would that look like?
I think for me, I'd probably end up blowing most of that budget on the land. But if I wasn't doing that, I think I think there is, something we haven't seen yet in the market that is, I think everybody's trying to do this, but nobody's done it really well. It's like, how do you create a glamping experience where you feel like you have your own little parcel of land, like to go out and explore? And it's hard to do with the unit densities we have. And I know that's vague, but imagine like a little bit bigger unit that bleeds to the outdoors, that has a clawfoot tub 20 yards out into the landscape that you can go enjoy. Because I think so much of what we want to do is go get outside and have a little bit of that space to ourselves. And it's really hard to do that with the land costs and unit densities that we need to achieve to get that little extra experience where you can go out there and sit in the tub in the landscape and have that like real moment. I think that's a simple way of explaining what I'd like to get at, which is the unit doesn't need to be incredible. It needs to be really well detailed, because I'm not coming for the bed, I'm coming for the nature, right? So I tell a lot of clients, you're bringing people to this place, the unit should just support it. The unit's not the star. And if you make the unit the star, you're wasting money on this really beautiful site.
Well, if there's any crazy rich people, don't invest in Will, actually invest in Posh Outdoors. But,
if there's any left over, then
yeah, if there's any left over, you can have the spare change, Will.
Yeah, sounds good.
And I make so much money through Posh that there'll be lots of spare change, obviously.
There you go.
What if you're really excited about one amenity that you're putting at a glamping location? What amenity are you most bullish on or excited about?
Most bullish on. I've got a client right now who's rolling out a couple big properties that are still in development, but they've got some fantastic covered outdoor space planned with a big outdoor shower. Basically like a 240 square foot unit with another 200 square foot outside. So I think that's going to feel and breathe like a 400 square foot suite that's still in that modular zone. And I think the other one that I'm really excited about is there's a lot of new efforts being made to do these like really cool lightweight modular structures that are going up in really sensitive habitats. That's the other area I'm really excited about, is some of these helical piers and floating tent decks that are up in the air that really don't touch the land. I think are really going to be pretty spectacular in some upcoming projects.
I can see a tear forming in Connor's eye because you didn't say a spa. Connor is a spa man.
No, I think, being able to be, the first business I wanted to create was called Immersive Nature Hospitality. And I totally agree with what you said, Will, which is my own personal philosophy, which is, let the nature do the heavy lifting, and so much of the unit design and the site design should play back to how can we accentuate the nature, work within it, preserve the best parts of it. And I think a structure that's fully suspended, and I'm imagining something that's like in the trees or, above the bushes or above the creek or near it. And so you can walk out on an outdoor deck and you're like, wow, I am immersed in nature. This is like a full sensory experience.
Yeah, it sounds negative sometimes to say, but you're not going to beat the Four Seasons, the W's, and the Ritz at the experience of the room experience. There's too many built hotel rooms that are pretty luxurious. And so what you can do is reach a point that is really nice and then open it up to that outdoor area. And that's what a hotel in New York or LA doesn't have, right? That's the outdoor experience, the view, being able to step outdoors and kind of inhabit that environment is what your competitors don't have. And I think that's what a lot of people lose sight of that. I think they get a little too wrapped up in the F&B or a little too wrapped up in the unit and the interior vibe and making it feel outdoors, when you just need to open the doors and step out, like get people out there, and it'll be much more successful.
I'd love to just run through like some ballpark numbers, because I think it's always helpful. And, these questions are always super hard to answer because it depends on so many factors: how many units, what type, availability of labor, and all those things. But let's say you're responsible for coming up with the construction budget of a 50 unit site that's in a typical state that's not super cheap or super expensive, and maybe you're 2 hours outside of a city, and there's no crazy topography or rocks or trees or something. Like what? And there's 50 units. Like what are you typically budgeting for? Hey, we're gonna, this much money is going to go into the horizontal infrastructure, like the utilities and the roads. How much is going to go into the units? and FF&E, or how much is soft costs for like, feasibility and architecture and design? Like, how are you in your first round of budget? How are you kind of thinking about those numbers?
Yeah, if I'm helping somebody do their first budget, and we're talking like crayon level math, right? We're just
yeah.
This is fat pen.
Crayons are good.
Crayon level math.
That's Nick and I's level.
Hopefully washable, erasable, so you can make edits.
Yeah.
But if we're talking like really high level numbers, let's start with like a unit type assumption. If we're doing a 180 square foot or 200 square foot modular cabin or RVAA model that's on a trailer, and we're going to ballpark that thing, with or without a few accessories and furniture at $100,000, right? I think then in most cases I would still look at another 100 to 150 on top of that to really build out that site. And to something that Connor, you and I have talked about in the past as we've talked about other projects, is from the ground up is relatively easy to estimate. We can apply some square footage numbers. If you're in California and it's a nice clubhouse, it's going to start at 600 square foot, 700, 800. If you're doing the clubhouse in, a Midwest lower, not super wintry place, you can drive that number down into the 300s and 400s and get a nice space. And the modular unit cost can be even lower. But the big delta for everybody is what's the surface of the earth down, that utility infrastructure. And that's where, you end up, we kind of circle back to some of those unit type selections. You're doing communal bathroom areas, or does every unit have it? And I think the point there is, one of the first things we talked about is finding that local expert. And that's been the biggest drivers is, you want to avoid that $1 million entry road that has to get cut into the side of the hill with a 12-foot retaining wall. And then you get to your wastewater treatment. I've never found a site, RV, campground, or other, that didn't need a massive wastewater system upgrade. Everybody looks at these projects and they're like, we can reuse a bunch of this. And they almost never do. Like maybe a few lines of electrical, the transformers are still getting replaced. Septic tanks and wastewater treatment plants are still getting replaced. And I've had clients that were in the 30 to 40 unit range, and at 30 units, it was pretty standard. They get to 40 units, and now it's a $500,000 package treatment plant just to handle the wastewater. So I think that like above ground number is really easy, and the below grade number with a couple miles of utilities and trenching and roadway, infrastructure below the earth, that's where everybody needs to focus their energy on first.
How much due diligence can you do on what those costs might be if you're looking to acquire a campground, for example?
Yeah, well, early on, a lot of what we've been doing at Boundary Works is when we do some of those initial site plan studies and we figure out, hey, ballpark, we think you're at 45 units or 50 units, to your example, Connor, and your density's not super high, you've got some loops of road and some parking. You get this rough site plan and program figured out. The first thing I always encourage people to do is I send them a draft up an RFP for some civil engineers and say, let's go do some preliminary grading and drainage work to figure out what the roads are, where the hiccups are. And then we're going to go call the local utility consultant and say, is there enough power in the area to even power this site? Is it single phase or three phase? I could answer a couple big questions. And then I would go back to the engineer and either get their opinion of probable cost, or I'd take a rough bid package out to a local site work engineer. And this is before we've decided anything about units, before we've even looked at the design of the clubhouse, or if there is a clubhouse. We're just identifying we've got 50 units, they've got their own bathrooms, and it's roughly this layout. Because you can stop there and do a lot of work on your due diligence before going down the road on all the other designs and all the other partners that need to get involved.
The only problem, and it's hard to find any kind of solution to this, is let's say the property is in demand and it's hard to get all that due diligence done, and if you need to figure out financing after as well, like sometimes it's chicken and egg, sometimes it's just straight up impossible to do all of that, get the financing lined up, and then secure the property. You can make an offer, but obviously they're not always going to be willing to wait around any more than maybe 30 days or something like that, and it's always difficult.
I loved what you just said, Will, because it I think it reaffirms what I tell people a lot, and you're certainly the expert in how I describe it to people. Let's just walk through a typical scenario for an entrepreneur who's out looking land shopping, trying to find a place for a glamping resort. They find a piece of land and they want to put a glamping property on it, and they want to put the property under contract or do some sort of LOI. And let's just say they don't have a bunch of, maybe we'll do one scenario where they do have a bunch of competing bids and there's a little bit of pressure versus one you have lots of times. I guess, how would you be walking a client through that? What would you advise?
I would say first to, I think it works to say, if you have a rough idea of what your ideal project size, scope, and budget is. Like if you could just put a big round number on it, like this is where I'm in the ballpark of whatever it is, 10, 15 million or 5 million, whatever that is, like pick a round number that's a starting point that's at least a workable number. Back yourself into something like, okay, I can't spend more than this on land. And then if you at least have a feel about that, and you've got a real estate agent who's local that can help you sort out some of those parameters and what's a reasonable price per acre, when you get into that negotiation phase, I think showing up with a clear, concerted effort, as a calm voice, not the angry, pushy one. And if you can negotiate and at least tell them in your bid offer, like, I would like, if I can, 3 months of due diligence, or 6 or 9, or like a lot of my larger institutional clients will negotiate a year of due diligence, and they will offer some hard money payments in there that they know they're going to go out the door, right? But ultimately, if you're thinking about, even on a small scale, if you're going to do a $5 million project with a few units out there, if you buy that land and don't cross your T's and dot your I's, and then have to unload that land, it will be far more negatively impactful to your long-term business prospects than losing $50,000 or $75,000 every 3 months during that first year of due diligence. So if you can come at it from like a more institutional view and say, yeah, I'm willing to lose some money to vet this thing properly and get an extra month or 2 months or 3 months or 9 months, whatever you think you can, work through, that'll help. That caveat is that there's a lot of these properties that you might have an individual buyer who's like, yeah, I don't need any of that. I'll close on this tomorrow. Here's my check. And I would be wary about trying to race those buyers to win. I would move on from that property probably.
Is there anything else that you think the institutions and the big boys do that the mom and pop operators either don't do or aren't even aware they should be doing? When it comes to negotiating due diligence, designing their site, process, anything in regards to setting up a business like this?
I think they know how much sort of dry powder they have in reserve. They're the best at, they'll go to the potential seller and say, my maximum is 100, whatever that is. But in their mind, they know they actually have 150. They're leaving a third or a quarter of their total buying power in reserve, because when the deal is marshaling through and it's 2 months into due diligence and you haven't gotten any answers yet because the civil engineer isn't returning your phone calls because he's out hunting, and you have like a deadline coming up, if you've been a good partner and you've left some cash in reserve, you can go to the seller and say, hey, I'd love to buy an extension. Here's some extra money to this deal to make it worthwhile for them to help you out. If you go in and you've expended all of your capital in this one shot to land this, you've got no room to move. You can't be a really good partner that's willing to chip more in. You won't make the seller feel like a partner. It'll just feel like you're taking advantage of them. So I think that's where a lot of the institutional investors are savvy, and that they know they have room to move, and a lot of people don't after that first big hit on the land.
I think you kind of just in this interview have sold the value of your expertise so well, and it's something that I certainly recognize. Everything from kind of the numbers that you threw out certainly agrees with what we see at Sage, and you being able to come in with a detailed plan to be like, first we need to figure out A and B. If those look good, we can move to C and D. If those look good, we can keep going from there. And having the wisdom of past projects to know what money to spend at what stage, so that you're mitigating your potential losses if the deal doesn't turn out to go the way that you want. And I think what you said about negotiating due diligence, whether that's 2 months or 12 months, the importance of that, cannot be stressed enough. One of the things that's really tough to navigate, and I've come from the entrepreneurial bootstrapping background. And then of course there's a really professionalized, more of a developer's approach where, they can come in and afford to spend 30, 50, 100 grand to find out if a project is good. But the reality is with your service that you offer, and this also rings true for Sage and feasibility studies, as I try to communicate this to people, it's like, hey, you'd much rather spend, the $15,000 with Sage to do a feasibility study and figure out, is there any red flags that we weren't aware of? Given our project scope, is this going to be a profitable project? And, you'd much rather spend $15,000 in 6 weeks to figure that out than spend 3 years and hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to find that out. And I think it's the same with your service. What could you tell us a little bit more about your services, what you offer, like approximate costs, just so the guests know and they can, get in contact with you for it?
Yeah. Obviously, every client's different. And I think one of the advantages of being a really small firm, we're 2 people right now with some extra help on the side as we ramp up and down, is that we don't need to sign a huge contract out of the gate. We don't need $100,000 commitment. We're operating in a lot of cases with like a $8,000 to $12,000 not to exceed contract, just to get the bare bones of a site plan together, talk through programming, help build that concept. And a lot of this early due diligence work is really them ping-ponging ideas off of me and my team and us coming back with, I think we should pause design and you need to go talk to a civil engineer and call us in a month when we know this might actually work. There's a lot of that back and forth in that early phase, but a really classic example that I've done about 6 times in the last year is folks have shown up with 40 to 80 acres and they've got an idea of the units they want to use and a rough idea of what they're trying to do. And we'll work through a site plan, a program that says, here's how many units, here's how many parking stalls, here's how many square feet of paving, here's how many square feet of decomposed granite trails. And they can take that with some nicely rendered site plans and a little 3D rendering of a potential unit, and they can go drop that into their investor deck and then come back to us in 6 months when they've got their ducks in a row and they've dialed in on the land and they've raised some money, and they can come back and do that. And sometimes that's all of our involvement, and other times we take it all the way through construction. We design all the structures, help them procure the units, help work through their back of house planning for how many housekeepers they think they might need. We can help design a space for that and work through the rest of the gremlins in a development budget.
What kind of client are you looking for?
Our ideal client is somebody who is, personally, somebody who's looking to do something that is really environmentally sensitive. A lot of these places are really, the land that people are able to buy these days is increasingly special and maybe a little more tricky and maybe a little more hilly. And, I think those areas, if there's conservation in mind, that's a big check, a big plus for us. If they are savvy enough to listen to the experts around them, that's a big plus. And if they are moving into this project with open eyes about the process and are willing to shift and move, that's a big plus. So said simply, we always try to go look for good work with good people.
And in any kind of particular project size, for example, that you might be working with?
Right now we're kind of in a sweet spot. We've been doing a lot of 60 to 100 unit projects because there's a little more there to talk about. What's the arrival experience like? Are we layering in more of a, full luxury resort feel? Or are we backing this off into more of a primitive campground feel? And we've also done a couple of smaller sites. So I think scale is less important for us than the sort of vision and concept that the owners are bringing to the table. And we've been working on everything now. We've moved into some more traditional hospitality projects as well that aren't necessarily, all strung out in the landscape.
You brought up a good point that I want to reiterate, and that is, if there's a listener out there who's got an idea and they're wanting to raise money, there's kind of a checklist that I tell people to go through. And the first is, and this is kind of if you need to go raise money. And certainly you can raise money without doing these things. There's always extenuating circumstances, but these will certainly help. And the first is you have to have the land picked out. It's really hard to raise money if you don't have land picked out. So like, stop there. There's really not a huge point to raise a lot of money unless you have a huge track record of success in this space. Not a point to raise money if you don't have the land picked out. And then the second thing is you either have your permitting in place or you have a really clear line of sight on the permitting. And then the second is, and probably feasibility study. And that is, you know, having your business proposal validated by an independent third party.
Convenient.
I know, right? A little plug. And then the fourth, and maybe this comes before feasibility or after, there's sometimes like a chicken and the egg, but that is site design, having a line of sight on utilities and some of those things that you mentioned, like speaking with the civil, finding about power, water, sewer, and having bids on your construction budget. That is when you have a real plan that you can raise money for, is if you have, kind of a first round site design and you have local contractors or regional contractors who've put bids in on the work that you want. And then the last thing kind of being renderings and a site design, so that when you have a pitch deck and you're going to investors, be like, this is the land, this is our permitting, this is the financials from a feasibility study, this is the rendering of our units, this is what the site design will look like. And that is so much more tactile for an investor to say, okay, I can see the vision, I can see the financials. Like, it's a lot. It's obviously certainly not a shoo-in because raising money is always hard, but those are kind of going to make your life a lot easier, I guess. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Will.
No, I think that's a pretty comprehensive list. I think a lot of people don't know where to start, and I think all three of us on this call are capable of, pointing people in the right direction. And, I'll be the first one when I talk to people that my expertise in the numbers and building a pro forma stops at the crayon level. But I know enough to help keep, poking around and finding the holes, and so when people are going through this, they've got to be, it sounds negative, but look for the potholes first and dodge those. I think that's the biggest thing. And then you can get back to the fun stuff and really flesh it out and work that design and build a really beautiful project.
Maybe we could end with some fun questions, Nick. I don't know if you have.
I hope you've got the fun questions lined up, because I'm checked out. I'm picking up my first beer. It's Friday 5 p.m.
We didn't have any beers today. Sad. Let's see. I was going to say, Will, do you have a favorite property? It could either be one that you've worked on or one that you didn't work on, but just like your favorite property.
Yeah, there's a really good one. It's that I visited. I did not work on it. My wife and I stayed there, and it's in southern Germany in a town called Garmisch, and it's called the Courtier Lodge, like quarter with an I in it. It was a historic mountain house, very iconic, white base, dark top, geraniums in a little planter box, and then they built this very modern addition of all these rooms down the line. And it was one of the first projects in that whole area to use cross-laminated timber for all the walls. So you walk into the unit and the room is 100% wood, like almost monotone. It's got a loft with a hammock. It has this really cool feature where when you're in the room and you're looking outside, you have a door to a gear closet where you can put your muddy raincoat and boots, and they actually drain outside, but they're protected in a outdoor locker, and then you can bring them back in. And it's one of the best outdoor destination hotels I've ever been to, because every detail like that, the bathroom, the gear locker, the use of materials is just spot on. And then they had the best feature every Friday night about this time. They had the manager of the local bike shop come in, and he would just sit in the lobby during happy hour. And you could go up and ask him, where should I go hiking? It might rain tomorrow. Where am I going to go mountain biking? What's a good trail if I am at this level? And they just paid him for the hour every week to sit in that lobby. And it made the best community experience. Everybody loved it.
Did they pay him in pints?
I think they did a bit of both. I think I think they may have paid him for the hour and paid him a couple pints.
Yeah, Bavarian steins.
Yeah, it was beautiful.
anyone who wants to see footage of that property, then go and watch. We do post these on YouTube, and our YouTube numbers are absolutely terrible. So feel free to go and watch on YouTube, but don't stop downloading audio because we want to keep them up as well. Will, if anyone wants to get in touch with you about asking you a question or hiring Boundary Works, how do they go about doing that?
We've got a website, boundaryworks.design, or you can email me at will@boundaryworks.design. So either one works.
So many good nuggets of information here, Will. I hope that we get to work on a project together soon.
We've been talking about doing a podcast project, me, Connor, and Jacob, the other co-host, and maybe you can be our consultant on it.
Perfect.
Yeah, I know we've worked on some in the past, but yeah. I just think that your knowledge in the space is so valuable to anyone who's wanting to get in. So thanks for all that you've done to keep pushing this industry forward and help people, creating their visions. So yeah, thanks for everything you do, Will.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys, and thanks for putting this podcast together and giving a voice to a lot of people who are, it's a relatively small industry, and I think there's a lot to be learned by sharing here, and so I really appreciate it.
Maybe that explains the download numbers. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Cool.
Cheers.